Thank you. I can't stand any higher and speak much louder. Sorry. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bernard Lima of BoxoPROJECTS. Welcome today to this lecture by Stephen Piller. Thank you so much for being here. This is part of the Boxo10x10, which is a series of programs and an exhibition of installations. The slideshow that you saw earlier are those installations up at Joshua Tree. So if any of you haven't been there, please come on up. It'll be running through to the end of December, to December 31st. We might try and have a New Year's drink for anybody who wants to come join us to close it. So thank you to Joshua Tree friends for being here as well. So I'd really like to thank Philip K. Smith, and Arnie Ehrlich of the studio for hosting us here today. As you know, Philip being very busy recently, he has a big exhibition up at the museum open until May 7th, and an exhibition as well at the Scottsdale Art Museum running concurrently. So if you're doing some desert traveling, check it out. Plus, of course, the wonderful work here in the studio. Also, just wanted to thank some of the Boxo people here, Danielle and Danielle Cornell, and Stephen, of course, are on the executive committee for Boxo, so thank you for being here. And Amy, who's our programs coordinator and generally does most everything. So, thank you for being here. Without more ado, I'll turn this over to Stephen. He's going to give a talk about light in desert art, and with a specific focus on Californian art. There'll be some time for Q&A. At the end, if anybody wants, raise your hand, and we'll sum it up quickly. But thank you again for being here. We appreciate it.
So, by show of hands, who'd rather talk about the World Cup? So, if you're not paying attention, Brazil and Netherlands both out on penalty kicks. England knocked out today. Morocco's going to win the whole thing. So this will be a really interesting talk, considering half the room knows more than I do. Jeez. Had I known you were all going to be here, I wouldn't have done this. So Bernard's going to help advance the slides for the talk. I'm going to cover about 135 years of desert art and light. And there has been art in the desert for 135 years. So we're going to, well, why don't you hit the first slide? So the idea of this came from a quote from James Turrell, the kind of preeminent light and space artist, who says the history of art is the history of depicting light. And so I kept hearing, there was a phrase, it was a quote that just kept coming back to me, and I tried to contextualize it to this place. Just like I do at the magazine, Palm Springs Life, it's all about place. You know, when people look at the magazine, I want them to kind of go, ah, like when you come off of the freeway at 111, and just have this particular feeling. And so this talk is really about that feeling and how artists, using all different mediums over a course of 135 years, from graphite to Philip K. Smith, and everything in between is what we're going to cover. So next slide. I'm going to give the talk in a linear fashion so that we can kind of get a sense of the trajectory. And this is an image by Gordon Coots, Mount San Gorgonio. It's a pretty familiar scene. And the idea here is to show how artists kind of engage the light, not only for the optical and perceptive qualities, but also the emotive qualities and what they want their work to do to you, and what they want you to get out of the work. So we'll look at artworks from the next slide, please. From the turn of the century to modernism, the modernists or postmodernists. Next slide. To light and space artists. We'll talk about this piece a little bit later. Actually, I might as well just talk about it. This is, Doug Wheeler is one of the founding fathers of light and space. This is jumping ahead about 70 years from where I'm actually going to start. But this is an interesting piece because what he's doing here, it's an all-white room with rounded corners. And this particular piece slowly transitions from kind of a super dark blue, kind of to this incredible white, giving you a sense of moving from day to night over a long stretch of time. And the rounded corners give you, it makes you question where you are in terms of the space around you. And so you're bathing in this light, which was a movement of art that started coming up in the 60s, and we'll get to light and space art shortly. But go ahead and move to the next slide. We're going to start with, this is actually from the 1850. 1853 is the earliest depiction I could find of the desert landscape. And this was done by George Douglas Brewerton, who was part of a US government survey. They were surveying the land. And this was the earliest depiction. And you can start seeing the use of the light and shadow in this piece. This is the old Spanish Trail, which I think most of it cuts through the Mojave. We know it today as the back way to Vegas. So if that's where this is going. So next slide, please. So in 1872 is when the Bradshaw stagecoach line started coming through from LA to Palm Springs, was kind of a middle stop between here and Prescott, Arizona. And then by 1877 is when the Southern Pacific came through. So around that time, the railroads would actually allow these artists to ride for free in exchange for the paintings, which they would then use to promote rail travel to the west, get folks west of the Mississippi. So these are a couple of the early desert painters, and I'm going to focus mostly on the desert. There's a couple of things that go outside of the desert, like that Doug Wheeler piece that we were looking at. But so James Swinnerton is one of the preeminent desert painters. He was kind of the dean of what some people refer to now as the Smoke Tree School. And Bill Bender is a painter also, but kind of also his chauffeur, dragging around the desert a lot. And but they're two pioneers, and in art historical context, the desert painters, and California Impressionism in general, is a brighter, happier kind of Impressionism, probably more relatable to French Impressionism than to even early American Impressionism on the East Coast, just because of the light. Even though French Impressionists like to depict, you can see those paintings and think of cafes and people walking around the city. That's not really what most of the California Impressionists were doing. They were focused on the landscapes. And there were some artists, particularly up in Northern California, the Monterey Peninsula. Charlton Fortune is a good example of one that would cover, would depict city scenes and people, and not too many of the early California painters were doing that, which is why we have kind of this wealth of this richness of Impressionism. I think the Californians, there's a couple of people in the room that might disagree with this, but I think the California Impressionist is the richest of all of the Impressionist schools, at least in American Impressionism, in terms of its breadth, its color, its the feelings that you get from it. So if you go to the next slide, this is referring back to the similarities between the desert painters, the California painters, and the French. That Mediterranean climate that allows you to paint outside all year, which you can't do in the East Coast. So that's kind of just drawing a similarity. If you go to the next slide. This is a piece by James Swinnerton that we just saw in that black and white photograph, an example of, you can just see how that light just works off the tip of that smoke tree. That's a Palo Verde, sorry. And this is in Box Canyon. I'm sure everybody has been. This is probably the best Sunday drive we have in the desert. That's an example of one of Jim Swinnerton's work. If you go to the next slide, this is another Swinnerton piece. This one's actually in my collection. It's just another example of how that light, he's just got this way of letting the light hit the top of these flowers, these blooms, these incredible blooms. This is an ironweed tree. This is a later one for him. This is 1965. Next slide. We saw that early opening shot. In fact, the next one, if you could show the next one too. Yeah, so this is Gordon Coots, and if you go back to the other one now. Gordon Coots lived here, which this building still exists if you, in the tennis club district of Palm Springs. This is now the Parroquia Pension, a little boutique hotel right by Spencer's restaurant. And that was Gordon Coots' home. If you go to the next slide. This is from the late 20s. And you can notice, as we saw in the very first one in the opening slide, the saturation that we're seeing. He did that in that San Gregorio shot that we saw a little bit earlier, where you get that golden hue. And that's kind of what Gordon Coots was known for, is this golden hue that would wash over the mountains and the sky and the sandy foreground. It's got this almost tonalist quality to it. And then the next slide is John Hilton, who came to the desert during the Depression looking for money. He remembered when he was out of money, he remembered somebody in the Coachella Valley who owed him some money. So he went out to collect on the debt and found that the guy he was looking for was dead. And his daughter, that's Jake. Very happy to see everybody. So his daughter gave him a whole bunch of stuff, potted cactus and all kinds of odds and ends as a gesture to help pay off the debt. And so he ended up at Valerie Jean Date Shop. Anybody hear of that? A couple of people know it, okay. This was a famous stop right near where Shields Date Farm is now. And there was a little place there that he brought all of this stuff. And he went to go get a drink, and these people started picking all the stuff out of his truck. and the person at Valerie Jean's successfully encouraged him to open up his own place right across the street. And that became a hangout for all the major painters. Clyde Forsyth and Maynard Dixon and Jim Swinnerton, and John Hilton, of course, was the ringleader. So eventually, this painting is from 1955. By 1955, Hilton had left the lower desert and moved to the high desert because he was sick of all of the celebrities that were showing up. And, it wasn't the desert that he wanted anymore, so he left. He went to the high desert, as so many people still do today. I'm doing so much of this from memory that So Hilton would learn, all these painters would just camp out at his space, and he learned how to paint basically from them. And that's kind of how the desert got into him and how he got into the desert. And if you go to the next slide, you can almost tell how he evolved. This is 10 years later. And if you look at some of the earlier paintings, they don't have the same light quality, but the later the years progress, the light becomes really distinctive, just like it is. And So he became one of the better known artists of this period, and he was one of the last of these painters to die. And his daughter was a painter, also, Catherine, and had a show at the Palm Desert Historical Society a few years ago. It was amazing. So if you go to the next slide. So it's not just the painters. So we spent a little time on the early desert painters, but they weren't the only ones. So this is a photographer, Stephen Willard, and Palm Springs Art Museum, by the way, owns the entire archive and all of the cameras and all kinds of stuff. It's incredible, the negatives. And this was our Ansel Adams of the desert. Aw, gee, he wants a better view. So Stephen Willard grew up in Corona, and when he was 14 years old, his dad, who was a dentist, actually bought him a camera that changed his life. And so he started around 1919 making this 68-mile drive from Corona to Palm Springs to start shooting the desert. And some of these early desert painters actually took him out and showed him the landscapes. And he'd actually take a vehicle by vehicle and by burrow. He would go out and find these incredible vantage points, these incredible perspectives, and he'd just wait for the sun. He'd study the light, he'd study the sun, and he'd go back day after day. And you know, they didn't have digital cameras. I mean, you had your film, and you get what you get, you know. And so he, I think, is one of the most underrated. I mean, you hear so many other, you know, Weston and so many other Ansel Adams, and I just feel like this guy has been lost in history, and I hope that Palm Springs Art Museum will do something major with that archive, because it's so deserving. If anybody here knows anybody at the museum. And most importantly was, I talk about the impact that these artists have on the way we feel, the emotive effects of their work, and not just the optical, but the internal things that we get out of it. This was also one of the first artists to have a political effect. This artist, Stephen Willard's work was partly responsible for convincing Washington, D.C. to create a national park out of Death Valley. And Minerva Hamilton Hoyt, used Stephen Willard's images to get Joshua Tree to become a national monument. And now it's, of course, a national park. So Stephen Willard was a consequential artist, and like I said, I feel pretty lost in history. If you go to the next slide, is another photographer. This is an iconic photograph by Julius Shulman in 1947 of the Kaufman House in Palm Springs, a Richard Neutra designed house that, by the way, a few months ago sold for $13.1 million. And so here is an example of how artificial light and natural light kind of come together. And we're going to talk about that idea more when we get to Philip Smith's work, because Philip's work relies on both natural and created light. So here, what I love about this shot, and the reason I picked this one of all of Julius Shulman's incredible images, is because I really, really love the way the architecture, the hard lines of the architecture are juxtaposed to these great natural, rugged lines of the landscape. It's just beautiful, and and then the intersection. So this is Lillian Kaufman. This is Kaufman's wife in front of the light to block, so you don't have that hot spot in the shot. So you put her there to block the pool light. It's just brilliant. It's just brilliant. And I went to the house to try to get a sense of the space, and now I think if Shulman was there today, he'd have to be standing in what's now a pool house to get this particular shot. But this is an iconic one, and again, it wouldn't have been possible without his is sensitivity to the light of the desert. Okay, if you want to go to the next one, I pivot here a little bit backward to 1932, which was maybe a decade before that last image was shot, to Agnes Pelton, who was certainly the most important modernist artist, modernist painter to come out of this area. She moved to Cathedral City in 1932. Her house is still there and owned by a couple who maintain it and promote her. Agnes Pelton she did landscape painting to support herself, and they were beautiful landscape paintings, which is more of an abstract symbolist painter. So they don't really work with identifiable motifs. It's more about their internal feelings and their inner visions and their real. If you go to the next slide, sorry. So this is one of her landscapes. If you go to the next one, they're more about expressions of her inner visions through these vaporous shapes and color, of course. If you go to the next one. Yeah, okay. So this one, I almost said this was Palm Springs Art Museum. It's not this Phoenix Art Museum. But this one is called Messengers, and the reason I included this is because Agnes Pelton's relationship with the light wasn't just a daytime experience. She liked to sit in her garden at night. She was a big gardener, and at night she would sit and watch the twilight. And so she would have these, like I said, these visions and feelings that she ultimately would express with these image shapes and colors that are, of course, abstract, but you can recognize the landscape. But they almost all of her work. If you go back one and then forward one, you can see there's always this kind of nucleus in the painting that becomes the light source, some kind of a geometric shape or an orb of some sort. And it's kind of a consistent motif in her work. Moving ahead, go to the next one. As we move into the 60s, hard edge abstraction, hard edge abstraction kind of became a new movement in the 60s. Lorsel Feidelson and Helen Lundberg, of course, and there's a whole school of those artists. And I picked Helen Lundberg because she kind of feminized the idea. That whole movement, she feminized it and really related it to the landscape more than any of the other ones did. And if you go to the next one of her students was Eva Slater. This is a piece that is in Palm Springs Art Museum, and I think it's hanging right now, and I picked this one because this is a great example of work that blends hard edge abstraction with landscape painting. And you're not going to find too many artists who did that, and I thought this was a really great piece. And the fact that it's our mountainscape here makes it even more special. If you go to the next one, if the hard edge folks didn't signal a dramatic shift, these guys did, the light and space artists. They didn't work on it. So a couple of them came out to the desert. Peter Alexander certainly had a place out here, and James Turrell, of course, is doing his big Woden crater in the desert as well. So the desert is a significant part of the light and space experience. Most of them worked on the coast and were very affected by the ocean and the light, and even surf culture, which is how the Finnish fetish movement became associated with light and space. The wax on the surfboards and the wax on the cars and the woodies. So there was this obsession with surface And so Larry Bell is one of the artists that fell into this group of light and space artists. And so these guys were less interested in making pretty things for your house and more interested in engaging you in these ideas of perception of light and space. And so these are artists that are all about perception, not about putting an object on your wall necessarily. A lot of these artists engaged with architecture, as you see in this image, and created these immersive environments, as you saw in that very first image with Doug Wheeler. Robert Irwin was another one. If you go to the next one, I think here's Robert Irwin, yeah. And I think, do I have Peter Alexander? I don't know if I have one in there. Close, Helen Pashman. She's another one. But you can see that the experience of these pieces is about perception. It's about slowing down, experiencing your space, experiencing the light and these optical effects. They take time. These are pieces that you can't just walk by and say, "Well, I saw it," and move on to the next thing. These are really about slowing down and experiencing these. They're experiences more than objects. So I made some notes about this. These are artists that would direct the flow of natural light or embed artificial light within other objects or even architecture, or play with light by using, and this is Philip Smith, by using reflective, translucent, or transparent materials that create situations to stimulate a heightened sensory response or awareness. If you go to the next one. Here's Peter Alexander. I love this piece. Peter, did you have this in your gallery? Is this one yours? This is yours. So let's go.
A couple in the back.
Jeez. Love these pieces. So Peter Blake is in the room, and he represented Peter Alexander's work. And thank you for coming all the way from Laguna Beach.
My pleasure.
If you go to the next one, this is a conceptual artist, John Davola, one of my favorite California conceptual artists. So John works in series, and he exhausts his ideas. And so this is a series that he created in, I think, from 96 to 98. And this is one of the later pieces he created. And this one belongs, I think the museum has this one in the collection. Is this in the museum's collection, Daniel, do you know?
It's not.
It's
in my
not?
collection.
So the reason I included this image is that before he shot this series called Isolated Houses, he did a series called Four Landscapes. And he shot some of these Jack Rabbit homestead cabins up in the high desert as part of that series. And that was a black and white series. But during that time, he just became transfixed by the light up here and decided after that to do a series called Isolated Houses. And so this is a really good one. And I chose this one because I know kind of the story behind it. He was telling me how he was racing across Amboy Road to get to this place, while the light, before he lost the light. And how he, as you kind of got near the place, you can start seeing some signs of life. You can see the Suzuki, you can see the chairs and this improbable power line going to it. And he was telling me that he pulled up and he got out of the car and you can hear a TV set on in there, and the guy comes out of the house and says, "What the hell are you doing here?" And you don't normally go onto these properties without expecting a gunshot. So And he says, oh, I'm just photographing your house, it's just so beautiful. And the guy, John told me he just kind of grumbled at him and went back into the house. And this became one of the most, I think, one of the more iconic views from that series, and just captured the light beautifully with those pink cotton candy skies. It's almost like a John Hilton painting. And incidentally, so when he went back to this house a couple of weeks later, reshoot it, the guy repainted the house white. Yeah, let's go ahead to the next one. Oh, this is I love this one. It's another John Miller shot. So many of you, I forgot I had this in here. This is a good one. This is a great one. So after he shot the isolated houses, so many of these places, of course, some people still live in them, like the one that we just saw, but a lot of them, of course, just fall into, disrepair and ultimately collapse. And I love the series, and I wanted to buy one, but then I realized he only printed them in and then, it's just too much. So, but I love these because it's almost like Anthony Caro sculptures, I just love, the light, just beautiful. Go ahead to the next one. Oh, and so when he was shooting the series, these dogs were chasing his car. And so he actually did a series called Dogs Chasing My Car in the Desert. He had this 35 millimeter black and white in his car, and he was literally leaning out of his truck while he was driving, shooting these dogs. I go to the next one. So now we get to where we are today. There's so many more artists that I could have included, and so many stories and anecdotes, but I actually teach a full day class on this stuff, and spend a lot of time with the early desert painters and more time with Agnes and other artists, but this is kind of a broad stroke.
So speaking of that, are you going to do that again this year or this summer?
I think so.
Like last minute?
We're talking about it. I haven't signed it. They want me to do something.
Everybody should go.
It's a fun one, but they kind of want me to do something a little bit different this year, so we're negotiating. This is actually the opening spread of a story I did on Philip last September, I think? Yeah, last September? A year ago September. When he was supposed to have a show at the museum, and then COVID and a new director and everything got in the way, and he shows up now, but I did the story a year ago. So, everything we just talked about comes together with Phil Smith, and it's just so great that we're doing this talk here. So this is Lucid Stead, done in 2013, or at least that's when it was revealed to all of us. He bought this, I think, in 2002, this place, 2000-ish? 2003. So, and then did nothing with it for all of these years, and then eventually decided to do something with it. And was working in the studio, making all kinds of renderings, and so he kind of came to this concept that deals with everything we just talked about in one fell swoop. This encapsulates it all. Reflected light, projected light, natural light, everything happens here. Because the outside, and I really should let you just explain it, but to hell with you. You can correct me if I'm wrong. So every other horizontal, so this is an old, thank you, that's going to make this a lot easier. This is going to be a lot easier. So every other horizontal beam is mirrored. And of course the door, I think it's 4 windows in the door? 4 windows in the door. That during the day are mirrored also, and as the light moves into darkness, as dusk, then the LEDs start giving you the color. And it goes around the entire color wheel. He's got it really well dialed in, all reacting to the colors that we see in the sky naturally. So it's this it's not something that you can just go and look at for a half hour and go, I saw it and leave. You need to spend the whole day with this thing. You need to go in the morning before sunrise and watch what's happening and stay there until the sun goes down and the stars come out. It's a durational experience. So, so it's about 4 ideas. Light and shadow, reflected light, projected light, and change. So the projected light's actually coming from inside, so that if you go back one slide, that you can, so the light projected from inside reveals, you know, the architecture. It reveals, you know, you can see, what do you call those things? The what? Oh, that, yeah, the bracing, diagonal bracing. So, you know, it's a reveal. It's kind of a reveal. And if you go back to the, I'm sorry, forward, and then the next one, I think? No, go back. This became a generative work. So this is what I consider Phil's seminal project. This instigated so many other bodies of work. We have 4 windows and a door, lucid stead elements, and everything that you're seeing now kind of came from this idea. It's all meant to slow you down. It's just like the light is constantly changing, this piece is constantly changing. All of Phil's work since this piece constantly changed. Even the non-light pieces, the big, what do you call them? The white pieces?
The discs.
The discs, yeah. Faceted discs, sorry. You're a hard guy to keep up with. So the faceted discs are, rely on the light in whatever space you're in to give you the light and shadow, and it changes with the conditions in your space. So if you go to the next slide, I mentioned that the generative process. This is an installation that Phil did at the Coachella Festival, just literally blowing his ideas up to, I think, how many stories tall was this one?
17 feet.
Jesus. So, you know, and it was a similar experience where by day it was reflecting the environment, and so yeah, thank you. And then at night you're bathed in this color. And if you've been to Coachella, you need these experiences to get away from all the insanity. And if you go to the next slide, that's in the next one. This is a piece that Phil did for Desert X, a circle of land and sky. So as you approach this piece from outside the circle, you can see the angle. I think it's what, 10 degrees? Yeah, 10-degree angle. And then as you approach the piece reflects the land, and when you're inside the piece, it reflects the sky. And again, it's a durational experience. Like all of Phil's work, you have to spend a day with it to really understand it. So I go to the next one. I don't know if there's, oh, that's a thank you. But you know, the whole point of this is to show that there's a history to artists using the light, and there's a trajectory of the innovation and the different ways artists are using the light to create an experience for us, whether it's an early desert landscape painting or an experiential landscape piece. The idea is the light is something that we all have in common. It doesn't matter what language you speak or where you come from, everybody understands this. And so the interesting thing is how artists harness it so that we can enjoy it or notice it. Some people in this desert don't notice what's going on around them. They, you know, to not be outside at sunrise, to miss the sunset is criminal. This is a magical place, and we're all very lucky to be here. Next slide is it's the end. So this is just, get outside and go look, and this is going to be happening in about 10 minutes. There's a lot more in my notes which I barely use. So, anyone has any questions? I'm sure I've got the answers. But, any questions? Well, that's
Do we have to spend the whole day to admire Philip's work? Did you put a bathroom into this instead?
The wonderful thing, and a lot of you know Philip well, and if you know a lot of artists, and you know Phil, he is incredibly articulate and thoughtful. There's no mistakes. There are just no mistakes. He just gets it and figures out how to harness it and put it back out in the world, so it teaches you how to look. And that's the whole point of this.
I have a question back here.
No more questions.
So, I'm really curious, and I think it feeds off of what you just said about articulating, using language around light, and how you see these painters and Phil in his work really talk about light and the verbal, and bringing it on the verbal level. When we see the paintings, we have those experiences. When we see the sculpture, we have those experiences. But I'm curious if you came across some of the writing from the early artists around their own personal experiences as well.
Yeah, John Hilton in particular wrote quite a bit. A lot of these, I always kind of come back to John Hilton because he was so prolific, not only as a painter, but as a writer. In the original Desert magazine that I can't remember what year it started printing, sometime in the 30s, and it went under in the 80s. And he was a prolific writer and really expressed it beautifully. There was also another writer named Ed Ainsworth, and his wife Catherine Ainsworth also was very good. But Ed Ainsworth was a columnist at the LA Times in the 60s, and is one of my favorite writers. I mean, he's not like an Edward Abbey, but he is somebody who really understood how to look at the desert and how to write about the desert. And he actually in the 60s did a book on these early desert painters that I was talking about. And I don't think I've read anybody do it better than he did, quite frankly.
What's it called?
I think it's Painters of the Desert. I think it's just Painters of the Desert is the name of it. But just look up Ed Ainsworth. Yeah, and there's a few books that he's done, and they're just so incredibly well written. Yeah.
Can you go into any more detail about that connection that you mentioned between the photographer Willard and Minerva Hoyt? The way in which his photography influenced her and what she was up to, or vice versa?
Minerva Hamilton Hoyt was actually kind of a socialite, and a mover and shaker. She was well connected. She had connections in DC, and she was someone that could really make things happen. And she was advocating for the preservation of quite a few lands. I mean, I mentioned Death Valley and Joshua Tree, but that wasn't it. I mean, there were other areas as well, and she was very effective. Obviously, we have 2 national parks, and she met Stephen Willard and was in awe of his work, and paid him in some instances to document very specific areas that she would then use with her own writings to instigate legislation to create these national monuments and national parks. So she was so well connected. She probably could have done it without the photography, but when people saw those images, I mean, they're just jaw-dropping. I mean, who can say no, right? So she was really effective. And Willard was, I keep saying it, but he's just so underappreciated for his contributions to landscape photography, and it was one of these pivotal people whose work really was, you know, transformational for the desert. Yeah. And I should say that he didn't just do black and white photos. He did postcards, and that sounds cheeseball, but without that stuff, he made this place so popular, and he started hand painting his photographs also, and the postcards, and you can go on eBay and still find them. There are a lot of collectors, and he was really responsible for promoting this place. He was a true pioneer, and not just as a photographer, but just as a leader in Palm Springs and beyond. Yeah, he's very influential. Yeah.
So the lodge at Death Valley has a Thomas Moran in
Oh
there.
yeah.
And he also was
Huge.
helped convince
Yep.
Teddy Roosevelt to even have national
Yep.
his painting.
Yep.
Amazing.
Yeah. There were quite a few artists.
You go into that dining room and you're like, this isn't the there's Thomas Moran and all these really big art. Maynard Dixon in there.
Yeah, Maynard Dixon spent a lot of time here, but not on this side, more toward the Salton Sea and Mecca area. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming.
I just wanted to thank Stephen. I enjoyed every form of interaction for Stephen. And thank you again for being here. Just to give you some context, I also wanted to recognize Jenny Wyman, who's on the advisory council of Jenny's godmother. And to give you some context on the 10 by 10, again, it's a celebration of the first 10 years of BoxoPROJECTS residency and programming in the high desert. Back in 2015, Philip showed the elements on Lucid Stead as part of Joshua Trio. I think that was the first showing. And he's been generous ever since then, and the relationship has been continuing, so I really want to thank you for that. And also to say the Boxo 10 by 10 is again on display until December 31st. Please come on up. This programming is also meant to expand and deepen support for BoxoPROJECTS. I see many supporters here today. If any of you have some capacity, please seek us out online or one of us from Boxo here. We'd appreciate your support, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, guys. I want to say thanks for coming today. It's awesome to see so many beautiful people and people that I love and cherish. So thank you for coming out. And I really, Bill, I want to thank you for being such a huge supporter of artists in the desert. You've helped my career very much so through your words and your beautiful placement at PSL Humphrey's Life. So thank you so much for that. And Bernard, thank you for everything that you do up in the Joshua Tree and the whole high desert and here in the Lower Valley. You also have been a huge mentor for me, for so many artists through the years. Thank you for your support. It was a no-brainer to do this here today in support of you and for Bill sharing his vision for all of us. So thank you for everything you do.